Welcome to Check This Out, podcast for kids.
And their grown-ups, where we explore interesting people, places, and ponderings that shape the world around us. My name is Amy Contreras.
And I'm Cece.
Welcome to episode 7 of Check This Out. If you haven't already, make sure to hit the subscribe button so you can be the first to get new episodes. In today's episode, we are going to learn about a famous American named Eleanor Roosevelt.
I'm excited.
She's most well known for being a former First Lady and was married to the 32nd President of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Now, you may be thinking, Amy and Cece, why are we talking about Eleanor Roosevelt before talking about her husband, President Roosevelt, as a famous American?
That's a great question.
Well, Eleanor Roosevelt was a truly incredible lady who made long-lasting impacts on the world through her activism, advocacy of equal rights, her philanthropic work, and her social reform work. Eleanor Roosevelt was an author, humanitarian, and a well-respected feminist who advocated for rights of others all throughout her public career. She evolved what it means to be a First Lady of the United States. She played a key role in leading the nation through 2 national crises, the Great Depression and World War II. And through her political activism and her after World War II diplomacy, she played a key role in the development of civil and human rights for all people.
She was a busy lady.
And besides, Eleanor Roosevelt deserves her own moment in the spotlight, separate from her husband's contributions.
Check this out.
I just used a bunch of fancy words to talk about Eleanor Roosevelt, all in a row that you might not have recognized. I used the words philanthropic, humanitarian, and feminist. Let's talk about what those mean. Philanthropic is a fancy word for charity or community service. It's about seeking to promote the welfare of others by giving money or time. Philanthropic work can be things like feeding the poor or giving money to charities. A humanitarian is someone who helps people in need and works to improve the lives of others. Humanitarian work can happen in places like hospitals or schools.
Oh.
A feminist is someone who supports feminism, which is very simply that everyone should be treated equally, regardless of their gender. Feminism means that everyone deserves the same opportunities, and it means girls are just as valuable as boys.
I learned something new today.
Now that we know what philanthropic, humanitarian, and feminist mean, let's get back to Eleanor Roosevelt.
Let's get into it.
What do you already know about Eleanor Roosevelt? Do you know about the work she did as the First Lady and after? Have you ever heard a quote by Eleanor Roosevelt? If you don't know much about her, that's okay. That's why we're here today.
Listeners, keep your ears open.
Because at the end of the episode, we will share 3 facts that you can continue to check out on your own. Keep your ears open and see if you can guess which facts we will highlight at the end. Eleanor Roosevelt was born in 1884. She was born into a wealthy New York family and was influenced by her family's philanthropic efforts and their focus on community service. Sadly, she experienced tragedy at an early age, losing a brother and both of her parents before she turned 10. She ended up being raised by relatives. As a child and young woman, Eleanor Roosevelt was described as having a serious personality. She was fortunate to gain access to an excellent education. She had private tutors until she was 15, and then she went to London to attend boarding school for 3 years. She loved boarding school and learning and being exposed to the world. She returned to New York in 1902.
Check this out.
Here's a fun fact. Did you know that Eleanor is actually her middle name? Her full name is Anna Eleanor Roosevelt. And if you're wondering, Eleanor Roosevelt was born Eleanor Roosevelt. She didn't have to change her last name when she married her husband. That is because her husband, Franklin D. Roosevelt, also called FDR, was a distant cousin of hers. He was her 5th cousin, once removed to be exact. They married in 1905 and had 6 children together. Someone famous walked Eleanor Roosevelt down the aisle when she married FDR. Let's see if you can guess who it was. Was it
A,
John F. Kennedy,
B,
Teddy Roosevelt,
C?
her dad?
If you think the answer is B, you're correct.
Eleanor's uncle, Theodore, otherwise known as Teddy Roosevelt, walked her down the aisle when she married FDR in 1905. He was the president at the time. As FDR began his political career, Eleanor Roosevelt initially did what most political wives did. She attended parties and made social calls to other wives of politicians. And if we're being honest, this bored her and it did not challenge her intellectually.
That does sound boring.
When the U.S. became involved in World War I in April of 1917, Eleanor was able to change how she spent her days. She got to dive into volunteer work, which she was passionate about. She visited wounded soldiers and worked at both the Navy Marine Corps Relief Society and in a Red Cross canteen. She loved volunteer work and thrived in these settings.
She had a lot of jobs.
If you've been listening to our podcast, you've heard us talk a little bit about World War I in the episode on Amelia Earhart. World War I occurred from 1914 to 1918, but the United States didn't enter World War I until 1917. This war was also known as the Great War and involved over 30 countries.
Wow.
A couple years after World War I ended in 1920, Eleanor's husband, FDR, ran for and lost the Vice President of the United States position. He then became sick with a disease called polio in 1921. This sparked her deeper involvement in his political career.
Check this out.
Do you know what polio is? Polio is an illness caused by a virus that affects nerves in the spinal cord or brainstem. Polio can lead to a person being unable to move certain limbs. This is also called paralysis. Vaccinations have all but gotten rid of polio around the world. President Roosevelt got it and lost the use of his legs as a result of paralysis from polio.
That must have been hard.
The combination of FDR's vice president loss and his sickness with polio prompted Eleanor to get more interested and involved in politics. A few examples include she participated in the League of Women Voters and the Women's Trade Union League. Eleanor also became the head of the women's division of the Democratic National Committee. Keep in mind, white women earned the right to vote in the United States in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. So she was active in driving female political involvement.
Oh, that's important.
When FDR eventually became president in 1933, Eleanor redefined the role of First Lady. Keep in mind, her husband became president during the midst of the Great Depression, so the nation was in a really challenging time.
Check this out.
Have you heard of the Great Depression? The Great Depression was an economic crash that started in 1929 and went through the mid-1930s. It caused a lot of people to lose money, lose their jobs, even their homes. For years after the Great Depression, people struggled to find work, which meant that they couldn't buy food or pay rent. It led to major social and economic changes, such as the New Deal, which President Roosevelt implemented with Eleanor's help.
Whoa!
Before Eleanor Roosevelt, the role of First Lady meant playing the perfect hostess and holding parties or social gatherings, not getting involved in political priorities like the New Deal. But she took on causes and activities that First Ladies had never been involved in historically.
Here are just a few.
Eleanor Roosevelt instituted regular White House press conferences for women correspondents who had historically not been allowed in the White House press room. She helped serve as FDR's eyes and ears throughout the nation. She traveled around the country on tours and reported back to him on conditions, programs, even on public opinion. She specifically reported back to him on the New Deal program. Beginning in 1936, Eleanor Roosevelt wrote a daily newspaper column called My Day, which she continued all the way until her death. Eleanor Roosevelt was a heavily sought-after speaker at both political meetings, schools, and various institutions across the country. She showed particular interest in child welfare, housing reform, and equal rights for women and racial minorities. She even lobbied her husband to appoint more women, and she successfully helped secure Frances Perkins as the first woman to head the Department of Labor.
What was your favorite fact?
Eleanor Roosevelt wasn't just FDR's wife or First Lady. She was his political ally and strategic partner. This was a massive shift in the role that first women historically played. Eleanor was the longest-serving First Lady, filling the role from 1933 to 1945.
Was there anything she didn't do?
Beyond political influence and redefining the role of First Lady, and keep in mind, First Lady is just a term we use to describe the wife of the President of the United States. Eleanor Roosevelt was an ally for African Americans and an advocate for civil rights. One of my favorite stories about her happened in 1939.
Tell me everything!
Eleanor Roosevelt was a member of a society called the Daughters of the American Revolution. This organization refused to let Marian Anderson, an African-American opera singer, perform in Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C. To protest this decision, Eleanor Roosevelt resigned her membership from the Daughters of the American Revolution. But she didn't stop there. She arranged to hold the concert at the Lincoln Memorial instead. And the event turned into a massive outdoor celebration with over 75,000 people in attendance.
I love it.
I have to tell you one more story because it's so cool. As Eleanor Roosevelt was traveling around the country on her tours for FDR, she attended a meeting in Alabama. The local officials in Alabama insisted that the seating at a public meeting be segregated by race. Eleanor did not like that at all. So she carried a folding chair to all meetings and placed it in the center aisle to show she didn't believe in segregation. She intentionally defended the rights of African Americans, the youth, and the poor. She worked to bring alienated and marginalized groups into the political process. Eleanor joined the NAACP in 1945 and was involved in the civil rights movement.
Check this out.
J. Edgar Hoover, the longtime director of the FBI, considered Eleanor Roosevelt's political views dangerous, and he believed she was a communist. She was monitored by the FBI, and they had a huge file on her, over 4,000 pages.
I want to check out more about that.
During World War II, which took place from 1939 to 1945, Eleanor Roosevelt served as Assistant Director of Civilian Defense, and she visited England and the South Pacific to create goodwill among the Allies and boost the morale of the U.S. troops overseas. FDR died in 1945, but Eleanor Roosevelt continued to make waves in political and philanthropic areas. She wasn't done just because FDR was gone. Here are a few things that she continued to do after his death. Eleanor Roosevelt remained actively involved in the Democratic Party until the end of her life in 1962. She served as a delegate to the United Nations, and she was chairman on the Commission on Human Rights. She also helped draft the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In 1961, President Kennedy appointed her to the Peace Corps Advisory Board and to the chairmanship of the President's Commission on the Status of Women.
She was a busy lady.
She wasn't just a political force. Eleanor Roosevelt was also an author. She wrote many articles and books, including her newspaper, My Day, which she published from 1935 until her death in 1962. She wrote nearly 3,000 articles in newspapers and magazines. She had a monthly column in Women's Home Companion, and she authored 6 books over the course of her life.
Was there anything she didn't do?
Eleanor Roosevelt died on November 7, 1962, and is buried alongside FDR in the Rose Garden of their estate at Hyde Park in New York. After all we've learned about Eleanor, see if you can guess her nickname. Do you think it was A, First Lady of the World, B, Miss Almost President, or C, First Lady Ellie?
Mama, can I guess? A. If you think the answer is A, you're correct.
President Harry Truman bestowed the nickname First Lady of the World on Eleanor Roosevelt for her humanitarian efforts and the political contributions she made throughout her life. Now, at the start of the episode, Cece told you to keep your ears open because we would give you 3 facts that we encourage you to check out later. I wonder if you can guess what they'll be.
Here are 3 of our favorite facts.
Well, we really like the fact that Eleanor Roosevelt was the longest serving First Lady of the United States. She held the position from 1933 to 1945. And Eleanor Roosevelt changed what it meant to be a First Lady. In her role, she advocated for civil rights, social justice, and women's rights. Learn more about her various positions and their impact. Fact number 2 we love. After FDR's presidency, Eleanor remained a prominent diplomat and activist, serving as a delegate to the United Nations and playing a key role in drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Check out more about what the United Nations is, what they do, and what the Declaration of Human Rights entails. Fact number 3. Eleanor Roosevelt was a prolific writer and speaker. Check out articles from her My Day newspaper or read a book or quotes written by Eleanor. Did you guess any of the 3 facts correctly? I hope so, but if not, have fun checking them out further. By now, if you've been listening to our podcast, you know we don't just love investigating cool people, places, and ponderings from history.
We also love to rhyme.
Before we share the poem we made about Eleanor Roosevelt, if you're enjoying Check This Out podcast for kids, please subscribe and like our episodes. And make sure to join us for episode 8 on Alexander Hamilton. And now, here is the poem we wrote for you about Eleanor Roosevelt. From New York to the White House she stood, a beacon so bright. Eleanor Roosevelt, champion of the fight. With passion for people, she helped make the New Deal. Her travels showed her what people needed so she could make the appeal. FDR's wife, an activist and author. Nothing could slow her. Nothing could stop her. She used her voice for the voiceless, raising money and hope. In times of great struggle, did she back down? Nope. The First Lady was a force unto herself. No one could put her away on a shelf. She drove hard all her life, and we remember her still. Eleanor Roosevelt and her power of will. At Check This Out, we know it can be hard to know if information you find online is accurate. We use verified sources to build the stories you hear about. Our sources for this week's episode are Encyclopedia Britannica, womenshistory.org, history.com, the National Park Service, Mayo Clinic, the FDR Library, and UC San Diego Eleanor Roosevelt College.
Don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for listening.